Good evening. Hello. We're going to find our seats. We'll get started. First, I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening to the Veritas Forum and Stephen's Christian Fellowship. I'm Will Squire, the president. Tonight we have a special guest speaker. His name is Dr. Tom Rudelius. He is a theoretical physicist at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. He got his PhD from Harvard last year. And let's show him a warm welcome.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. Can everyone hear me in the back? They're all right? Okay, great. So, indeed, my name is Tom Rudelius, and today I'm going to be talking about the question of miracles, and in particular, a little bit about the miracles of Christianity. Before I get into all of this, though, let me tell you just a little bit about who I am and what I study. So, as I mentioned, I'm a theoretical physicist. In particular, I study string theory and early universe cosmology. Please note that I am a cosmologist and not a cosmetologist. People get these confused very frequently. A cosmologist studies the universe. A cosmetologist studies cosmetics. So, hopefully someday I'll be a tenured professor. I'll have a little bit more free time. Maybe I'll start venturing into this third category. But for now, I'm pretty busy working on the first two. Anyway, so we're going to actually cover a lot of ground today in the next 40 minutes. First of all, we're going to start looking from a little bit more of a scientific and philosophical perspective at the question of science and miracles. Next, we're going to adopt a more historical approach and look at the miracles of Christianity in particular. And finally, we're going to adopt a more literary framework and talk about stories, and in particular, the story of the world. So without further ado, science and miracles. Now, when I say science and religion, the first thing that comes into a lot of people's minds is conflict. There's the scientific way of arriving at truth, and there's the religious way of arriving at truth. And the idea is that these two ways are in conflict, in contradiction with one another. And whereas our ancestors didn't know any better, they had to go to religious explanations. Nowadays, we modern, enlightened people have science. Now, first of all, there's certainly some merit to that. There have certainly been instances where science and religion have come into conflict with one another. But on the whole, it's too much of a simplification to say that science and religion offer just totally mutually exclusive paths to truth. Because the truth is that there are many times when you can have both a scientific explanation and a metaphysical explanation operating simultaneously. And a famous example of this, you could ask me, Tom, why is the water boiling? I could give you some long scientific explanation of how water boils, or I could simply say that I wanted to make a cup of tea. So both of those answer the question, why is the water boiling? But one of them is a scientific explanation, one of them is a metaphysical explanation, and in no way do they contradict. And indeed, I would say that probably some 99% even of the apparent conflict between science and religion comes when people fail to make this distinction between different types of explanations, and they either try to extend science into the realm of religion, or they try to take religion and extend it into the realm of science. Now, on the other hand, as a Christian, I can't simply say that science and religion occupy these totally non-overlapping spheres, because there are some cases in Christianity where science and religion come into more direct contact. And that's particularly the case for miracles. So miracles are probably best thought of as breakdowns of the laws of nature as we normally understand them. So you might wonder, can someone believe in science while simultaneously believing in miracles? Can you have a high view of science and also believe in miracles? I would say that, again, the answer is yes, and here's how I like to think about it. So if you look at the laws of physics that are, as they're formulated in your introductory physics or engineering courses, you find that they refer to closed systems. So the law of conservation of energy says that the total energy of a closed system remains constant over time, and so on and so forth. Now here's the point. A system in which God is miraculously intervening is not an example of a closed system. And so the laws of science have nothing to say about it. It's not that science is wrong. It's simply incomplete. It's not in the business of describing the world in the presence of supernatural intervention. That's just not its job. So I would say that science and miracles are logically compatible with one another. And in fact, I really don't think that's such a controversial question. I think the more interesting question, the objection that some people would bring up is, well, yes, okay, so miracles, science are logically compatible. But nonetheless, a miracle is just astronomically improbable. So we can never say that a miracle has probably occurred. I think the issue with this, well, there are a few of them, but the one I want to mention is that it assumes a particular worldview. Namely, it assumes a naturalistic worldview. So naturalism, sort of the staunchest form of atheism, holds that our material universe is all that exists. That's all there is. And on this view, our universe is probably best thought of as a mathematical structure. Right? So this is what when we talk about the laws of nature, right? What are we talking about? We're talking about some specific mathematical equations which describe, and in this view, actually define reality. Right? That's the view of naturalism, is that these mathematical equations give a complete description of the material universe, which is all there is. And on this view, of course, a miracle is impossible, or at least astronomically improbable. Because if the laws of nature are all you have, it doesn't make sense to say that one of them can break down. Now, the issue is that naturalism isn't the only game in town. And in particular, if you want to assess, say, the miracles of Christianity, it won't do to assess them on a naturalistic worldview. What you need to do is to assess them on the worldview preached by Jesus himself, namely theism. And so the question shouldn't be, how improbable is a miracle given naturalism, but rather, how improbable is a miracle given theism? Now, I could say a lot of things about theism. Unfortunately, time is short. But the one thing I would say is that on theism, our world is probably best viewed not as a mathematical structure, but rather as a story. Now, this actually isn't so crazy, I claim, right? Our world, our universe, has many properties that you would expect of a story. It has a setting. It has our planet, our universe. It has an apparent flow of time, which is something that's actually really weird from the perspective of physics. It has characters. It has people interacting in ways that make sense and are rational. It even has apparent good and evil. You know, there seem to be moral values and duties. There seem to be good guys and bad guys. Really, our universe seems very much like a story, except there's no clear climax. More on that later. But a consequence of this, first of all, is that God should not be viewed as just another character in the story. On theism, rather, God should be viewed as the author of the story. He doesn't relate to us the way that, Ron and Hermione relate to Harry. He relates to us the way J.K. Rowling relates to Harry. This is in contrast, for instance, with, say, the gods of Greek mythology, or of pagan religions, or even characters like the Tooth Fairy, or the Easter Bunny, or leprechauns. God is not just another character in our story. The God of classical theism is best viewed as the author of it all. Okay, so now for the question at hand, let's ask, are miracles probable or not on theism? And I think what you'd have to say is that miracles are at least not enormously improbable, and they, in fact, may be more probable than not. After all, think of all your favorite stories. Don't they all involve some sort of magic or miracles or at least something extraordinary, right? If our world really is best viewed as a story, then miracles are not enormously improbable. They might even be more probable than not. So unless one is very committed to this staunch view of atheism, called naturalism, I would say that miracles are not necessarily such improbable occurrences, not necessarily such an improbable occurrence. But once again, there's a difference between saying that a miracle is possible or even probable and saying that a miracle has actually taken place in our universe. Throughout human history, many people have claimed supernatural powers. Where in this vast sea of likely counterfeits do we look for a bona fide miracle? And so what I'm going to argue today is that the right place to start looking really is with Jesus 2,000 years ago. So we're going to do a little bit of a historical investigation. And for this, the first thing we need to do is figure out what is the lens through which we're going to view history. This is sort of a problem because scholarship on the historical Jesus is sort of wildly divided across the spectrum. But for the most part, scholars can sort of be sorted into one of two camps, which I'm going to call the conservative and the liberal, respectively. Now, note, first of all, that I'm not making a political statement here. I'm certainly not trying to push any sort of political agenda. And in fact, for that reason, I've put conservative on the left and liberal on the right to remind you that we're not here talking about politics, but rather we're talking about methodology. Now, across the board, critical scholars do not treat the Bible as the inerrant Word of God, but rather as a set of historical documents like any other. Within that, though, conservative scholars tend to have a much more favorable view of the New Testament documents. And if you ask them why, they usually point to things like the early date of composition of the New Testament relative to the events it describes. They point to the vast number of manuscripts. And indeed, by those metrics, the New Testament does much better than other ancient texts. On the flip side, liberal scholars tend to be much more speculative of the New Testament. Much more suspicious of the New Testament. I think part of this is due to the fact that these scholars tend to be much more skeptical of the miraculous in general. And of course, since the New Testament is full of miracle stories, it follows that one would be skeptical of the New Testament as well. So liberal scholars tend to, say things like the Bible was written down many years after the events, written down not by the people to which it was originally attributed, full of legendary accretions and early Christian theology, and so it's not a super reliable source of data. Now, there are some really brilliant people on both sides of this divide, people doing some great work. On the other hand, there are also some scholars who are perhaps more on the fringes. And on the liberal side, this is probably best exemplified by a group known as the Jesus Seminar. So the Jesus Seminar was a very famous collection of scholars who voted on aspects of the historical Jesus using a system of colored beads. These guys were very upfront about their presupposition of naturalism. The Christ of creed and dogma can no longer command the assent of those who have seen the heavens through Galileo's telescope. Now, from what I've said so far about miracles, you might think that I would disagree with this sort of statement. Of course, I do. But I think it's actually very good that the Jesus Seminar was so upfront about the presuppositions that they brought to the table. The more frustrating thing about the Jesus Seminar was that they portrayed themselves as being representative of mainstream scholarship, or even indeed of all scholarship. In fact, the version of the Bible that they put out was called the Scholars' Version, as in, this is what real scholars believe. But the problem is that the data just didn't back this up. Many of the members hadn't even published a single paper in their field. One of them didn't even have a doctoral degree, but simply master's degrees in math and physics, to which my response is, why wasn't I invited? So Luke Timothy Johnson of Emory writes, the numbers alone suggest that any claim to represent scholarship or the academy is ludicrous. Now, you might think that I'm just going to sort of stand up here and bash the Jesus Seminar and explain to you why you should listen to conservative scholars instead. But I'm actually not going to do that. First of all, although the Jesus Seminar did have a number of people who probably didn't belong there, they also had a handful of very brilliant and highly regarded scholars as well. And we'll hear more from them shortly. Furthermore, though, from a more strategic perspective, As someone who was raised in a very non-religious family, one of the hardest things for me, I think, about coming to faith was basically just learning to trust Christians. I think we Christians tend to sometimes make some rather silly arguments. We tend to take some rather silly stances. And I think for a lot of people, this is a huge turnoff. And a lot of people are just very suspicious of Christians and Christian scholars altogether. So today I'm going to try to do something else, which is I'm going to try to sidestep this issue altogether by focusing on the aspects of Jesus' life that are agreed upon by pretty much the entire spectrum of scholars, from the conservatives to the liberals and even the Jesus Seminar. Of course, anything I say, anything we talk about tonight, you can always find someone out there who will disagree. But I'm going to focus on the aspects of Jesus which are considered to be at least probably reliable by the Jesus Seminar. That's going to be our defining feature for this evening. And we're going to see that even from that perspective, there's still a rather strong case to be made for the miracles of Christianity. OK, so without further ado, I give you the historical Jesus according to the Jesus Seminar. The first point of consensus about Jesus is that he prefaced his teachings with the phrase, "Amen, I say to you." This is to be contrasted with, say, the prophets of the Old Testament, who you see frequently preface their teachings with the words, "Thus says the Lord." So Jesus, on the other hand, doesn't speak on God's behalf, but rather on his own behalf and on his own authority. And that's why you see in a couple of places in the New Testament, the author writes that Jesus spoke as one with authority, not like the other teachers of the law. A second point of consensus is Jesus' love. Jesus shared meals with sinners. He taught his followers to love even their enemies. And he told a number of parables demonstrating the radical love and forgiveness of God, including these three from Luke 15, three of my personal favorites. I think this is important for a few reasons, but one of them is that it shows that Jesus didn't just talk the talk, he also walked the walk. Jesus preached this idea of a God of radical love and forgiveness, but he didn't use this to try to get worldly power. You know, he didn't drive around in a Ferrari, right? Jesus was very sincere in his convictions, and he lived them out. He taught that God was loved all, that he was welcoming sinners into fellowship with him, and Jesus did that too in his own life. The third point of consensus, getting now to the actual miracles, this always comes as a huge surprise to people, but today, just about all of modern scholarship agrees that Jesus performed acts which he and others believe to be miracles. So in particular, the skeptical Jesus Seminar considers 6 of the 19 faith healings attributed to Jesus in the Gospels to be probably reliable, including the restoration of sight to 2 different blind men. Robert W. Funk writes on behalf of the seminar, the fellows by a narrow majority concluded that Jesus cured at least one blind person. John Dominic Crossan, you cannot ignore the healings and exorcisms. Throughout his life, Jesus performed healings and exorcisms for ordinary people. And Marcus Borg, it is virtually indisputable that Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. In all likelihood, he was the most remarkable healer in human history. Now, let's not go too fast here. You can't go all the way from this to therefore saying, aha, Jesus really was, a miracle worker, the divine Son of God. Because, in fact, there were other people in ancient history, and even in today's world, that have performed such seemingly miraculous deeds for which there was no readily available naturalistic explanation. So that's just a fact of the world that we live in. It's something you have to wrestle with, whether you're a Christian or an atheist or any other worldview. But I think this is very important in establishing at least that Jesus was in a relatively small group of people throughout human history that have a legitimate claim at supernatural power. And in fact, if we're willing to believe Marcus Borg at face value, we might even say that he's number 1 on the list already. But of course, we haven't gotten to the most important and the most incredible of Jesus' miracles, which is the resurrection. Before we get there, though, we first have to take a look at the death of Jesus and the circumstances surrounding it. So the next point of consensus is that shortly before his death, Jesus made a final journey to Jerusalem. After all, Jesus was executed in Jerusalem. Now, this doesn't seem like such a big deal, right? People make trips all the time. But the thing is that although Jesus was, well-loved amongst the social outcasts and the sinners of society, he was not so popular amongst the religious authorities. Jesus was accused during his lifetime of being in league with the prince of demons. He was accused of being a glutton and a drunkard, probably a lot of other nasty things as well. Jesus had no shortage of enemies, and furthermore, his close friend and mentor, John the Baptist, had recently been executed by these very authorities. As a result, Jesus would have had to be incredibly naive not to realize the grave danger that he was placing himself under by returning to Jerusalem. And yet, he did it anyway. So this is sort of a first hint that Jesus might not have viewed his death as being some catastrophic failure, but rather as a part of his ultimate mission. So with this, we get then to the parable of the tenants. This parable, again, is considered an authentic teaching of Jesus, even by the skeptical Jesus seminar. It appears not only in the Gospels in the Bible, but also in the non-canonical Gospel of Thomas. So I'll let you read it to yourselves as I summarize it. Basically, Jesus tells this parable about this master of a vineyard who sends servants to the people of this vineyard. And the servants are beaten, they're rejected. Finally, the master sends his son, and the son is killed. From the perspective of Christian theology, it's very clear what this parable is trying to get at. The master of the vineyard represents God. The people of the vineyard represent the people of Israel. The servants represent the prophets who have been sent to the people of Israel, who have been beaten and rejected. And finally, the Son represents Jesus, right? The Son of God come to die at the hands of his people. Now, apart from that theology, though, you might wonder what on earth could this parable be teaching? I would say that liberal scholars tend to have different answers, but none of them are very compelling. So here's John Dominic Crossan, an especially bad example. He calls this, quote, a deliberately shocking story of successful murder. Now, I'm guessing here that nobody is a New Testament scholar, but probably if you're at a school like this, you did pretty well on your SATs. And you know that this is not the correct interpretation of this passage, right? This is very clearly not a literal account. It's very clearly a metaphor. And it becomes clear what the metaphor is if you go and look at Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah 5, you see this exact image where God is explicitly likened to the master of a vineyard, and the people of Israel are explicitly likened to the people of the vineyard. So it's clear that Jesus has taken that parable and he's inserted the Son into it. Not only does this give us further reason to believe Jesus' view of himself as the Son of God, but also, more importantly, it shows that Jesus likely viewed his death as being significant in some way. After all, the death of the Son is the entire point and the climax of this parable. So with this, we're finally led to the last point here, which is Jesus' institution of the Lord's Supper. Shortly before he was executed, Jesus shared a final meal with his disciples that involved the breaking and passing of a loaf of bread and the sharing of a cup of wine. What exactly Jesus said when he did this is debated by scholars, but what's clear is that very shortly after his death, this moment in time was commemorated by the early Christians as being representative of Jesus' body being broken for his disciples, his blood being poured out for his followers. And this is something that, for those of you in the audience who have been to church or been to a Catholic Mass, you've probably even experienced this or seen this, right? The practice of communion or the Eucharist, in which you eat bread, symbolizing Jesus' body, and drink wine, symbolizing his blood. So this, in light of this, and the other points I've mentioned, other arguments I don't have time to get into, many, although not all, scholars will indeed acknowledge Jesus' view of his death as being redemptive. Michael Grant, Jesus lived his last days and died in the belief that his death was destined to save the human race. Maurice Casey, he believed that his death would fulfill the will of God for the redemption of his people, Israel. Finally, it's worth mentioning that Jesus was, in fact, killed. This is one of the best attested facts regarding Jesus' life, attested by numerous sources, both Christian and non-Christian. Okay, so that's the life of Jesus up through his death. Now my question to you is, what comes next? We've seen that these aspects of Jesus' life, generally agreed upon by scholars across the spectrum, point to his supernatural power, his miracles, his exorcisms. They point to his radical love, sharing meals with sinners. They point to a theologically significant death. What do you get if you put these three things together? If this is Act 1 of a story, what might you expect Act 2 to feature? To me, the answer is pretty clear, and it's a resurrection. A resurrection clearly points to supernatural power. It clearly points to a theologically significant death, because after all, you need a death in order to have a resurrection. And finally, it points to extreme love, because it shows that in the end, this unjust execution of this miracle-working righteous man is not the end of the story. God's love is more powerful than the grave. And so with this, we're now led to the miracle of the resurrection itself. And the first point of consensus here is that the disciples were sincere in their belief that Jesus had been raised from the dead. In other words, they weren't lying about it. The early Christians were very willing to undergo persecution for their faith. We know that many of them were actually martyred. In one place, Paul actually boasts about all of the torture that he's undergone for the sake of the gospel. Those are not the words of a liar. The disciples were sincere in their belief. So the question then becomes, how do you explain this belief? You know, the resurrection is a weird thing for us modern people. You know, we don't like miracles. The resurrection, that's weird. The resurrection, though, was also weird for the people back then, albeit for different reasons. In the Jewish conception, the resurrection wasn't something that was supposed to happen to a single person in the middle of history, but rather to everyone, all the righteous people, at the end of time. So you need a way to explain how it was that these followers of Jesus somehow came to believe that he'd been raised from the dead. And again, the consensus answer is that the belief in the resurrection is based, first of all, on the appearances of Jesus to his followers after his death. These appearances are incredibly well attested, both inside the Bible and outside, and most importantly, very early on in the Christian creed that Paul recites in 1 Corinthians 15. Hence, even a modern, liberal, secularized Protestant like E.P. Sanders can say that Jesus' followers and later Paul had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. Sanders goes on to call these experiences, quote, almost beyond dispute. Gerrit Ludemann, one of the foremost opponents of the resurrection, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. And finally, yes, even the Jesus Seminar agreed that Mary Magdalene, like Peter and Paul, had at least one visionary religious experience of Jesus after his death. The last point that I need to mention is the empty tomb. So this is not a consensus. Many liberal scholars, including our friends at the Jesus Seminar, deny that Jesus' tomb was ever discovered empty. But nonetheless, the arguments are compelling and strong enough to convince at least most of critical scholarship of its historicity. I'll give you three arguments quickly for the empty tomb. The first one is that Christianity grew up in Jerusalem, where all of these events supposedly took place. There would have been plenty of people who would have loved nothing more than to dig up Jesus' body and parade it through the streets, but the fact that Christianity had survived to the present day indicates that this could not have happened, likely because there was no body to be found. Secondly, and this is a big one, is that resurrection appearances by themselves would have been insufficient to produce belief in the resurrection. We know today about these things called grief hallucinations, in which someone, usually an elderly person, will have a vision of a recently deceased loved one, usually their spouse. Here's the thing, though, is people back in those days knew about these grief hallucinations as well, albeit not by that term. But if you had such a vision of a recently deceased person, it was considered proof not that the person was alive, but that the person was dead. And in fact, you actually see this even in the Bible. If you look at Acts chapter 12, Peter miraculously escapes from prison. He knocks on the door where the disciples are in hiding. A servant answers and runs back and tells the disciples, "It's Peter." And they say, "No, you're crazy. It must be his angel." See, what they think has happened is that Peter has died in prison and his angel has come to bid them farewell. That's what these visions meant in the ancient world. Proof not that the person was alive, but that the person really was dead. And so even if you had this incomparable chain reaction of visions amongst Jesus' followers, almost certainly it would not have compelled them to the belief that Jesus had been risen from the dead. It would have convinced them, aha, he really is dead. Scholars generally agree that you need something else besides just the appearances to explain belief in the resurrection. And the answer that the New Testament gives very clearly is the empty tomb. The claim of the New Testament is that the empty tomb plus the resurrection appearances is what led to belief in the resurrection. So if you want to deny the empty tomb, you need to concoct something else out of thin air. Finally, the argument that has convinced the most scholars throughout recent history is the discovery of the empty tomb by women. Back in those days, women were considered to be unreliable witnesses, highly unlikely that someone inventing a story of the empty tomb would place women as the key witnesses. And yet, in all four of the New Testament Gospels, it's the women who are the first to discover the tomb. Okay, so there it is. It's sort of the best case that I can make for the miracles of Christianity and the resurrection in about half an hour. Now the question is, after all this, where do we fall? Personally, I am very much of the opinion of the late, great atheistic philosopher Antony Flew, who once said, "If we are in a position to suppose there is a power external to the world, then no doubt the case for the occurrence of these particular miracles, as well as for that of the supreme miracle of the resurrection, would be open and shut." You know, Antony was an incredibly honest intellectual. He was very willing to admit where the weak spots in his arguments, in his worldview were, and he was very willing to admit that indeed the evidence for the miracles and resurrection in Christianity are very strong, and there really isn't a good naturalistic alternative. And personally, I would actually hold that even if I weren't a Christian. None of the alternative explanations are very convincing at all. However, what Antony would say, probably what a number of you would say, is that although, yes, fine, you know, the arguments are compelling, in the end, I find the arguments against Christianity, the problem of evil and suffering, the hiddenness of God, I find these arguments to be just so strong that although, yes, this evidence is powerful, it's just not nearly enough to compel me to believe in Christianity. Now, if that's you tonight, let me say first of all that I sympathize greatly. You know, there really are good objections to Christianity, and there really are some attractive features of naturalism or other worldviews. I would also say, though, that I disagree quite strongly, because although I don't think that ancient history is the most reliable source of truth, as a scientist, I still think that the hard data of ancient history is far more reliable than metaphysics and philosophy, which I consider to be much more speculative. However, what I'd also say is that it's clear that you can't just take the evidence for the miracles of Christianity and staple them on to a naturalistic worldview. Whatever the right answer is to all of this, I can guarantee you that the right answer is not that for no reason 2,000 years ago, the laws of nature just spontaneously broke down for no reason, and some dead guy came back to life. Right? That is not the right answer. So the challenge then to people like me as Christians is that we need to be able to situate the evidence for the miracles of Christianity in a larger narrative, a larger story of the world, if you will, that not only explains the historical data we've seen tonight, but also makes sense of the world around us, and even makes sense of the meaning and purpose of human existence. And so for this, I have one last little parable for you. A number of years ago, these two good friends by the name of C.S. Lewis, who would go on to write the Chronicles of Narnia, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who would go on to write The Lord of the Rings, were walking down Addison's Walk in Oxford, England. And they were talking about fairy tales, or fairy stories, as Tolkien calls them. You know, the kind of stories where good triumphs over evil, and everybody lives happily ever after. And Lewis, who was an atheist at the time, said that these stories are lies, though breathed through silver. You know, they sound good. We love these stories. But in the end, they're just lies. Because in the real world, our stories don't end in happily ever after, but in death. Our youth will fade, our memories will be forgotten, and every good thing, every wedding, every childbirth, every moment of hope and joy and love and laughter will someday be swallowed up by death. These fairy stories are just escapist, said Lewis. They're ways that we try to escape reality and make believe that our lives have ultimate meaning and purpose. And Tolkien, who was Catholic, responded by saying something that would ultimately lay the foundation for Lewis to someday become a Christian. Tolkien said, you know, these fairy stories, they are escapist, but they're not escapist in the sense of a soldier who deserts his fellow troops. Rather, they're escapist in the sense of a prisoner who knows that there's a world outside his prison cell, even if he can't see it. These fairy stories aren't lies, he said, but rather they point to an underlying reality, the reality that good should be triumphing over evil, the reality that death shouldn't have the last laugh. These fairy stories point to an underlying reality that's almost more true than the world that we actually live in. Go take a look at the evidence for the resurrection, Tolkien told Lewis, because the resurrection is that underlying reality breaking into our world. Tolkien coined the term eucatastrophe to describe this sudden, impossible, joyous turn of events at the end of every great fairy story that snatches victory from the jaws of defeat. He wrote, "The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. There was no tale ever told that men would rather find was true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. This story is supreme, and it is true. This story has everything: the loving hero, the heroic self-sacrifice, a quest through a world of evil and darkness, and just when things are at their very worst, life out of death, love conquering the grave. The humble man dies and returns as the king he truly is, and evil defeats itself." This is the ending of every great story that you've ever read, every Disney movie that you've ever watched. But this is not just another great fairy story. This is the true story to which all of those great fairy stories are pointing. And what this means is for those of us who will take up Jesus' call to follow him, there will be a eucatastrophe in our stories as well. All of the wrongs of this world loved ones dying, relationships ending, war, poverty, sickness, injustice, death. All of these things will someday be set right. There is a happy ending to the human story. There is a love that conquers death, and there is a God who made you, who loves you, who is begging you to come home to him, and who is inviting you into his resurrection. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rudelius. Now we'll be breaking up into small groups of about 3 or 4 to talk about some of the things we believe ourselves and formulate questions that we can ask Dr. Rudelius in about 10 to 15 minutes. So you can break up into small groups. Excuse me, I hate to cut off good conversations. We've got to get moving with the Q&A portion. We'd like to finish up by 10:30 so we can allow some time for Q&A now. I guess you can just raise your hands and Dr. Rudelius will call on you if you have any questions. Sure.
Hello, my name is Luke. I just have a two-part question. So the consensus that were these consensuses, I don't know the plural of that word, of your inception, or you found these through the Jesus seminars?
Yeah. Okay, good. So as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, what I took to be the defining feature of these things are aspects of Jesus' life which are considered to be at least probably reliable by the Jesus seminar. So yes, that's sort of the defining feature. So anything that I mentioned is something that you can go and buy the scholar's version for yourself and see.
Yeah, gotcha. So then my second part is, it's interesting how they would use the Gospel of Thomas as one of their consensuses.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know how much you know about the Gospel of Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas is a list of sayings attributed to Jesus. The date of it is sort of very much in debate by scholars, anywhere from the late 1st century to sometime in the 2nd century. And how reliable exactly the Gospel of Thomas is relative to, say, the other canonical Gospels is also something that's very much debated. Liberal scholars, I would say, in general, tend to have a more favorable view. This isn't always the case, but in general, tend to have a more favorable view of the Gospel of Thomas, whereas more conservative scholars tend to favor the Gospels in the New Testament. Regardless, though, what's so compelling about, say, the parable of the tenants is that it's not only in the Gospel of Thomas or only in the canonical Gospels, but rather in both. And so it's when you have that multiple attestation of the same thing being found in numerous sources that the probability of it being authentic increases a lot. So that's why it's important that it's in the Gospel of Thomas. If it were only in the Gospel of Thomas and not in the New Testament Gospels, then I think a lot of those scholars would not believe in it. But it's the fact that it's in both that makes it compelling. Yeah, good question. Let's start here. Yeah.
So, thanks for the talk, by the way. It was great. Like for instance, in our current day and age, there's like say magicians who can use like a sleight of hand to kind of trick and deceive people, and it seems like a miracle has been taking place. Yeah. And there's even unfortunately in like the Christian community where there's like faith healers and it seems to me that a lot of the people who experience it, they're just like amazed, and even their followers would say that like this guy's perfect and like he would never do anything wrong. So like could it be possible that 2,000 years ago there was this guy who's very talented at using sleight of hand trickery, and he claimed to be the Son of God, and even though and people, his followers said he was a very good person because he was just that amazing.
Yeah, good question. Okay, good. So, so there are a few things that I would say in response to it. The first one, so looking at here what John Dominic Crossan, the Jesus Summoner, had to say, right? These guys are, by a narrow majority, compelled that Jesus actually did, heal a blind person. So at least for them, they would say they would rather go to this. They would rather go to like a real, legitimate, healing of some sort, rather than say that it was just some magical, some sleight of hand thing. In fact, what the Jesus Summoner would say, right? Because these guys aren't conservative Christians by any means. What they would say is that actually what happened is that these are sort of psychosomatic cures. That Jesus, there's some sort of placebo effect that people think that they can, that they're having this experience and then they really can see. So that's one thing. Secondly, I would say, is it possible that Jesus was like a magician performing this sleight of hand? I would say that's very unlikely given the character, what we know of the character of Jesus. I mentioned, Jesus' love here. It really seems like Jesus was a very authentic, good, righteous guy, and it seems certainly out of character from what's attested to Jesus in other places. But finally, the argument that I think is what I most want to say is that what you often can do for any of these individual points that I made, any individual healing, for any of those individual points involving the resurrection, you can certainly find a naturalistic alternative, I think. Like the empty tomb. You could say, well, maybe someone stole Jesus' body. For these miracles, maybe there's some sort of sleight of hand. Having to explain just one of them can be done. But it's when you have the whole sequence of them, and you have to come up with a different explanation for all of them, that I think the probabilities start multiplying together. And I think the probability of having this enormous sequence, to me, seems much smaller than a single story which ties them all together, which is the Christian story. So rather than having to say, that Jesus was simultaneously, this great loving guy, and also happened to be like a magician who was fooling everybody, and also happened to have his body stolen from the tomb, and also having to put all these things, these independently improbable things together, from the perspective of probabilities, what you want to do is you want to find some story which ties them all together so that these events are no longer independent. And I think that's what the Christian story does.
Yeah. So I thought you presented a lot of good arguments. Like I feel like they're very compelling for believing the empty tomb story. Like the people that can't quite believe in that, where do they tend to fall short? Like what hangs them up?
So for the empty tomb in particular? So the arguments that I've seen most commonly against the empty tomb, first of all, is that the empty tomb is not explicitly attested in Paul's writings, which are the earliest New Testament documents. So the claim is that these are something that sprung up later in the gospel accounts. On that, adding to that, the empty tomb is something that certainly would have been beneficial to the early Christians as they were going around trying to make an argument for the resurrection. And so the idea is that this is something that might have sprung up naturally anyway, these fables, these stories. And the other one is that I've heard mentioned a few times is that, so Jesus was executed as a criminal, right? It was supposed to be an embarrassing death. And so as a result, the argument goes that it's unlikely that Jesus would have been given an honorable burial, which is what the New Testament says, that Jesus was given an honorable burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. And that's what all the gospel accounts say. So what some of these scholars would say is that they would deny that burial ever took place. Jesus was just thrown in some, unceremoniously in some common burial plot, and so there was no, tomb to be found. What I would say in response, if I may, since I am not since I am not an atheist, is that, first of all, Paul doesn't explicitly mention the empty tomb, but I would say he does seem to imply it in his writings. After all, the Jews in those days had a very physical conception of resurrection, and so it's very hard to imagine that they would say that Jesus had been raised from the dead if they meant that his body was still lying around in a tomb. Furthermore, although it's the case that, yes, usually most criminals, would be thrown into a common burial plot or something of the like, it's also true that Jesus was no ordinary criminal. Jesus was, even non-Christian sources say that Jesus was executed unjustly. He was very clearly not a typical person. And so it's not, I think, too crazy to think that somebody, maybe even someone with authority like Joseph of Arimathea, might have decided to give Jesus a more honorable burial, especially because that's what the New Testament says unanimously is exactly what happened. So I think in the end, as I mentioned, most scholars are convinced that of the New Testament's, of the empty tomb's reliability, but it's not a sure thing.
Yeah.
So my question is, if miracles happen today, to what extent can they happen? So for example, in the case of Moses, you see like pillars of fire and like parting the Red Sea. So kind of like, to what extent can miracles happen in today's age?
Yeah, to what extent can miracles happen today? Yeah, good. I was really hoping someone would ask this question. So I believe that miracles still happen today. Let me give you, you hear about miracle stories frequently. I can give you two that I've heard that I find more compelling. So one of them, I have a good friend whose name is Aaron Wall. He's a postdoc in my field, currently at Stanford. Exceptionally bright guy, also exceptionally devoted Christian. He'll tell you a story about his cousin who had like a twisted muscle or something in his leg. And the doctors, when he was young, told him, there's nothing we can do. They brought him to church, and they prayed for him, and he was healed, and now, today, he plays soccer. Another story I've heard, a friend of a friend works for a group known as the Jesus Film. So the Jesus Film is, I believe, the most watched film in human history. It's this this film depiction of the Gospel of Luke that's been translated into I don't know how many hundreds of languages and shown all over the world. And in one showing, they were in a country where Christianity is basically not not acceptable. It's not allowed. And when they were watching this, a blind woman who was watching it, or more specifically listening to it, heard the part where Jesus heals a blind man. And when she saw this, she exclaimed, "I want to see too." And instantly, she was healed. Now, other people in the town couldn't believe this, so they supposedly had her come up and light a candle in front of everybody to prove that she had actually regained her sight. And when this happened, dozens of people from the town instantly that day became Christians. Okay, now why do I tell that story in particular? Well, so my friend who was talking to his friend who works for Jesus Film, he heard this story and he asked him, I used to hear stories like this all the time from the Jesus Film. These stories of crazy miracles happening where new people hear the message of Christianity for the first time. Why don't you guys report these anymore? How come I never hear about them anymore? Have they stopped happening? And the guy said, no, they're happening just as much as before. But what we found is that when we wrote about these stories and we showed them to people in the West, they didn't produce faith, but rather they produced skepticism. See, we modern enlightened people in the West, when we hear miracle stories, we don't say, aha, wow, what a remarkable thing that God has done. We instantly sort of, red flags go up and we say, oh man, I don't know if I can believe this. This sounds too crazy. And I know that people here do that because I even do that myself. Right? When I hear stories like that, immediately, red flags start going up, definitely my walls start going up. But I think what this really shows, the skepticism of miracles today tells us less about whether miracles are possible, but rather it's more of a reflection of our own state on this. The problem is that we've all sort of embraced this naturalistic view that I mentioned, where miracles are just the most improbable of things, and so we say they can never happen. And the thing is, what we say is, when we hear things like that, we say, okay, there must be some sort of scientific explanation. And you know what? I mean, science is a remarkable tool, right? I mean, I'm a scientist. I love science. It's a great tool. But it's just one tool. And for the naturalist, it's the only tool in the toolbox. And when all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. You see the miracles of Jesus, and you say, oh, well, that just must be sleight of hand. You see these miracles today, and you say, oh, that must be some psychosomatic cure. Really? How are we so sure about that? It looks just like a miracle. I think unless you're really devoted to this naturalistic view, we should be much more open to the fact that perhaps these apparent miracles are just miracles.
Okay, yeah.
Oh yeah, so when I was young back in China, Jesus was kind of a Santa Claus, how to pronounce that? Yeah, kind of character, white guy, beard. And when I came to US, I went to a Catholic school, and the physics teacher there actually told us that God operates on a different frequency, actually a different level than us. For us, for him, the world down here is like a book. It's outside the realm of time. It's outside our dimension, all that kind of physics thing. So my question is, for such an incredible creator or author, using your example, why does he bother to practice all these miracles? And actually, why does he even write such a story?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, first of all, I agree with what you were saying at first. And I think maybe, when I talked about thinking of God as the author of the story, right? He's not just a character, he's not Santa Claus. So I agree with that. The question then is, why would God write such a story? Why does he bother to send us these miracles? I think the short answer is just that he loves us. The long answer, or maybe the slightly longer answer, is that I'm not really sure exactly why God does all the things he does. Part of the definition of what makes him God is that he's miles and miles above us. And so I can't pretend like I can figure out exactly why God does everything. But what seems to be true in the Bible, at least, is that God really and deeply loves this world. He loves this creation, and he loves the things in it. So for instance, one of my favorite chapters in the Bible is Job 38. So you can read that for yourself tonight. So Job 38, what happens in Job is Job, all these bad things are happening to him, and he's complaining. And finally, in chapter 38, God finally answers him out of the storm. And God starts basically, talking all about his creation, and asking Job, like, hey, if you understand so much, why don't you explain this to me? Why don't you explain the stars to me? Why don't you explain day and night to me? All these things that are just so far beyond Job. But the image that you really get from that is that, God really loves the world that he's created. God loves the galaxies. God loves the creatures in our world. He loves even, I would say, the process of evolution, that all of these things are beautiful to him. But in particular, what's maybe most important for us is that the Bible teaches that God also has a special love for mankind, that we are made in the image of God, that he intrinsically loves us, not for anything that we have done, but rather just because he's good. And so he can look at us even though we're messed up people, even though we're broken, even though we're rebelling against him, and love us enough to come to send us these miracles, to send, most of all, his son to come and die for us.
Right.
Yeah, here.
If God is the final figure, if what our life purpose is to achieve salvation and join Him, why did He let science flourish in the first place to put a question on our faith?
Why did, sorry, I don't think I heard the last part.
But why did God let the science like this everything, the logical thinking that we do, what the scientific proofs we have, like those are the reasons which from which we question the miracles, right?
Oh, for which we question the miracles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why did He let them flourish in the first place?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so good. Okay, so why, if science is the reason why we, if this modern scientific mindset is the reason why we question, God's miracles, God's love, God's existence, why would He allow us to embrace these things? So the first thing I would say is that science by itself is not a bad thing at all, right? Science is a great thing, First of all, okay, as a scientist, obviously it pays my paycheck, so I love science, but it also, right? Like think of the advances in medicine, think of the advances in technology. All of these things are not bad things, and so science overall, it's a great thing. The problem is when what mankind has a tendency to do is we have a tendency to take good things and to turn them into ultimate things. We take something which is supposed to be good, which is supposed to be helpful to us, and instead we essentially worship it, right? So this is what you see in the Old Testament where people would turn and they would worship a statue made of gold. We think we modern people are much smarter, but yet we look to science to give us meaning and purpose, and the truth is that science isn't ever going to be able to do that. Science isn't going to give meaning and ultimate meaning and purpose to our lives, and it certainly isn't going to give us the same sort of eternal life in the presence of God that Jesus offers. So maybe this is more than you wanted to know, but why would God even allow us to be led astray by anything? The answer that the Bible seems to give us is that God extends free will to mankind, and He's very patient with us. So you see this, for instance, in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, where God, represented by the Father, gives His younger son the share of the inheritance and lets him go off to a far country and spend it all on prostitutes and wild living. That's the image of God that the Bible gives, is that although God loves us, He wants us to come and return to Him, He doesn't sort of force Himself upon us. And so what you see again and again throughout human history, and again in the parable of the prodigal son, is that what mankind tends to do is we tend to take the good things that God has given us and we tend to abuse them. We tend to take science and we abuse it. We produce things like the eugenics movement, etc. And so, I think in the end, science is a great thing, but it's not the ultimate thing. Yeah, another question here? Sorry.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah.
Right, you mentioned the word love a lot, like the concept of loving. Like, love is a human thing. Actually, no, love is a Santa Claus thing. It's more like one of those common fairy tale stories. For example, Jesus performing a miracle on those blind people to heal their eyes.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like what a creator would do. I mean, you study about the universe. You know how vast, how big the universe is. Well,
Yeah.
like, we just happen to be the one planet where God gave His only Son to, and God cares about the eye of a woman that much that He performed a miracle,
Yeah.
breaking the seemingly perfect physics law in this universe. Like, wow, what an honor to the lady.
Yeah.
And I just want to explain that. Like, what are the chances that we are the chosen one, and like, why does God bother to help us?
Yeah, I mean, you know, some people look at the world and look at the universe and say, wow, it's so big. You know, how could God possibly care about us? Well, first of all, you know, I care about a lot of things that are small. You know, there are a lot of big things that I care less about than, say, like a baby. You know, like my cousin or something, right? So size isn't a very good indication of value. I think rather a better interpretation is that we should look out at the vastness of the universe and not say, oh, wow, what are the odds that God would care about us? But say, wow, God must be really big. In fact, actually, I think the vastness of the universe is a good argument in favor of God and against some sort of simulator. Some people have argued that the universe is like a simulation. People have, have pursued that idea. But the problem with the simulation is that if our world is being simulated on a finite computer, it's extremely inefficient. There's way more out there than is needed to produce life. So I think the vastness of the universe actually just points to the designer not being limited by efficiency. As to why he loves us, you know, again, this is sort of the remarkable thing about Christianity, is that despite the fact that we are not good people, the fact that we have done nothing to earn God's love, that he loves us nonetheless. You mentioned the idea that love is like a fairy tale thing, like a Santa Claus thing. And again, I would say that that is assuming a naturalistic worldview. On naturalism, this idea of love is just a chemical reaction in the brain, something that we mistake for true love. But on theism, it's the other way around. The love is the fundamental thing, and this chemical reaction in the brain is just the physics, the mechanisms that produce this. Love is the true thing that actually lasts. This material universe is just the way that it gets there.
Okay.
Sorry, I have to cut it here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you may have more questions, but we have to cut it here. Fortunately, Dr. Rudelius and I and the other leaders of SCF will be around, and you can come speak to us if you have more questions. And on the same line of thought, if you want to get more involved with this or do this and figure out some more about what this is on a regular basis, we meet here Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Every week. There's also a mailing list in the back if you want to sign up for that to get weekly reminders that we meet here. You can sign up for that. I would also ask that you fill out this survey. It'll take 1 minute, 60 seconds. It is for the purpose of feedback for the Veritas forum. That's its only purpose is for feedback. They're not going to send you a bunch of emails at a time. It's just for internal purposes only. Other than that, we'll be around. You can come speak to us. There are snacks in the back, and feel free to talk to those around you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Professor.